A single baseball card lay on the floor of an old caretaker's shack, edges curled, colors washed to the pale of late afternoon. Dust lifted in the beam of my flashlight. Somewhere outside, the river moved like a long breath. On the back of that card, a boy had once written his name. The ink had bled, but I could still make out the first letter. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. I was 30 in the fall of '97, a patrol officer with fresh creases in my uniform and a habit of showing up 10 minutes early to everything. I rented a small place near the courthouse white siding that took the wind hard in October, and a porch light that burned a soft amber every night I was off shift. Mornings came cool and blue then. I'd lace my boots, drive the 2 miles down Maple Street, roll past the feed store and the barber with the checkerboard tiles and stop for coffee at the diner, where the counter still creaked if you leaned on it wrong. Most days carried the same rhythm school zones at 7:30, a fender bender by the grocery at noon, a lost dog by supper time. It was the kind of quiet that taught you to measure time by the courthouse clock and the smell of wood smoke. Ridgetop sits just over the river where the road narrows and the air cools 10 degrees by the water. If you stand on the bridge at sunrise, you can watch fog roll out of the cottonwoods like it's being poured. The town hasn't grown much in my lifetime. One main drag, 2 churches, a baseball field with chalked baselines that go crooked in the wind. Folks here know the price of a gallon of milk without checking, and when they say they'll be there by 5, they show up at 4:55 with a pie they just happen to have. You can hear a screen door slam from half a block away on still days. Back then, I thought that sound could carry anything that needed carrying. Mark Delaney fit this place the way a well-made chair fits a kitchen. He kept an office between the insurance agency and the floral shop. The lettering on his window was gold leaf, old-fashioned and careful. I'd see him out front sometimes, straightening the open sign with a hand that never seemed to hurry. He had a laugh that didn't aim for a crowd, more of a quiet release at something only he found funny. His boy Ethan was all elbows and knees, and that way teenagers have of running like they've just grown into their legs. He kept a stack of baseball cards in his jacket pocket and passed them around the bleachers when his team wasn't at bat. I remember him scowling at a bent corner like it was a real injury. The Delaneys lived on a street where maple leaves piled up to your ankles by Halloween. Their house was a square 2-story with a step that clicked if you didn't lift your foot just right. After the funeral for Mark's wife 2 years before that fall, neighbors made casseroles and propped sympathy cards on the mantel, and you could feel the town pull tighter around the house the way a quilt draws in at the edges. Grief changes a place, and it changed Mark, but not in a way that drew attention. He still coached on Saturdays, still stayed late at the office when a crown fell out or a kid chipped a tooth on the monkey bars. When people thanked him, he waved it off like it was nothing more than how things are done. I kept my eye on the bridge that season the department always did when the fog settled low. Tractor trailers used the span after midnight headed to the plant on the state line, and the grade up from the water could ice first when nights dipped into the high 30s. I kept a blanket in the trunk with the jumper cables, a habit from academy instructors who hammered the small stuff. On evenings when I wasn't on duty, I'd run the river road at dusk 4 miles out and back with the smell of wet leaf and diesel for company. The traffic hum would thin to a single car every few minutes. If it was warm enough, say 55, the crickets would carry the gaps between engines. In the cool, you got only your breath and the tires folding over seams in the blacktop. Sergeant Louis Vega wasn't my partner then, not officially. He ran nights more often than not, and had the far-off look of a man who knows exactly where to put you on a line without offense. We shared coffee when shifts overlapped. He'd sit with one ankle propped on his knee, listening the way only a few people do, eyes steady, no rush to fill the silence. Keep your notebook, he'd tell me. Ink outlasts memory. He wasn't wrong. There's a comfort to small routines when you wear a badge in a quiet county. You learn that Mrs. Weaver's porch light is always on because she likes to read mysteries until midnight. You learn that the McRaes keep their Buick on the street when their son visits, and no, it isn't suspicious. You learn which dogs bark from boredom and which from warning. And you learn if you're paying attention to catch the tiny seams that don't lie flat. That month, a nurse at the clinic mentioned Mark to me in passing. Not a complaint, just an observation that he looked thinner, that his hand trembled once when he signed a form. The floral shop owner said he'd started buying singles after hours, not bouquets, like he didn't want to carry more than a single stem at a time. Nothing you'd write up, not then. I made a note because that's what I do. It was the kind of mark you tuck in the margins in neat letters and don't think you'll need. Ethan showed up early to baseball practice the last Saturday of September. The field faced west, so by 5 in the afternoon, the light hit low and gold across the grass dust, lifting from the baseline like breath. He leaned on the fence and asked me if I thought it got colder faster by the river, or if the bridge just made it feel that way. It was the sort of question kids ask when they're really asking something else. I told him the truth, that the water pulls heat out of the air and carries it downstream. He nodded like that settled it, and slipped a card through the chain link to show me the pitcher he liked best. On his way off the field, he checked over his shoulder twice. I noticed. I wrote that down too. On Tuesdays after patrol, I like to stand behind the dentist office and look at the light throw a calm square on the alley bricks. There's a reassurance in those small tells, every business with its regular glow, the undertaker's lamps steady the library lamps soft. The night I'm thinking of now, Mark's light burned later than usual. Through the back door window, I could see him cleaning instruments by hand, already in a jacket like he had somewhere else to be. There was a thermos on the counter, stainless steel, the kind that keeps coffee warm long past midnight. He set it in the sink and left it there empty. He almost never left things unfinished. I knew that about him because I watch. My own life was simple, almost orderly, to the point of a metronome. Thursday dinners at my aunt's meatloaf green beans with too much butter pie if she'd had time. I'd leave at 8, drive the 3 miles home lights from the high school parking lot, thinning out block by block until only the river kept a low, steady roar like distant freight. I kept the radio soft in the car so I could hear tires on the road. That sound tells you everything: the condition of asphalt, the shape of weather, the weight of the world moving past you at 50 miles an hour. The first hint that the season had shifted came in the shape of a phone call that never quite settled into words. Dispatch rang the office line late one evening with a report about lights near the water. Nothing dramatic, just a note from a trucker who didn't like the look of a vehicle idling too close to the rail. I wrote it down: possible disabled car on bridge late fog. We got those from time to time in October when a tail light looked like something more in mist. An officer went to have a look and cleared it. I logged the time and finished my paperwork. The clock above my desk ticked loud enough that night to feel like it was keeping its own kind of secret. I saw the Delaneys at the grocery that week, father and son moving in sync through the cereal aisle. Mark checking a list folded into a tight square. Ethan thumbing through cards as if he couldn't quite keep his hands still without them. We said hello in that aisle way people do when everyone knows everyone. Mark's smile was the same polite, present patient, but his eyes tracked the door at the far end like it owed him an explanation. There are details you only notice later after something hard has taught you where to look. I noticed them anyway. It's the job. Autumn came on hard the second week of October. The mercury hit 39 degrees by daybreak and held there, and the river threw up a white band of fog that didn't burn off until close to 10. The feed store switched out seed displays for snow shovels. The barber kept the door shut to hold in the heat from a little space heater that could char your shins if you got careless. The courthouse clock sounded different in colder air, sharper like the metal had shrunk, and the hammer found more rung to ring. I started carrying gloves in my jacket and tucked a spare blanket behind the driver's seat. Sergeant Vega and I crossed paths at the diner that Thursday night. He was finishing a late bowl of chili and gave me half a smile with it, eyes studying me like he could see the pages turning in my head. "Bridge'll be slick soon," he said. "You got grit in the trunk. I told him I had 3 bags and a shovel." He nodded like that answered more than the question. We talked a little about weekend coverage, about the high school game that would crowd the lot and put kids in pickups they didn't yet know how to handle. When I left, he tapped the counter once, a small rhythm that felt like assurance. On my way home, I took the long loop to the river, a habit that keeps me honest. Fog gathered again at the low spot by the culvert, and the span rose out of it like a bone through gauze. A semi rolled across, slow red lights blinking, then another. When the road emptied, I cut the engine and listened. You can hear the current if you give it time, a deep, steady push that doesn't argue with rock. It just moves on. I counted 11 breaths and turned the key. The last ordinary Friday of that season began with sun and ended in a chill that crept under cuffs and collars. My shift ran late, 2 reports to finish, and a call about a minor dust-up that turned out to be nothing but a neighborly dispute over trash cans left too far into the alley. I stamped my papers, slid them into a file, and shut the drawer with the kind of satisfaction only a clean desk at 9 o'clock can offer. Outside, a thin skin of frost had formed on the cruiser's windshield. My breath hung in the air when I turned toward the river road. Around Ridgetop, we don't rush porch lights. Folks leave them on for peace of mind, for the way a cone of warm amber can make a house feel like a held breath. That night, as I passed the Delaney place, their porch light glowed the same soft tone I'd seen 100 evenings before. A pair of work boots waited by the door, neatly side by side, laces tucked. The living room shade was down, but a seam of light showed along the edge, suggesting a lamp still on one of those old brass ones with a pull chain you can hear click across a quiet room. I drove on toward the water. A low bank of fog had started to build again, not a blanket, yet more like a veil. The bridge was a dark line ahead, lights on the trusses pulsing in a slow rhythm. My hands loosened on the wheel when I saw the span was clear. In town, the diner's sign flickered once and steadied. The courthouse clock struck 9. Back on Maple, the Delaney porch light still burned. A single moth beat against the glass in clumsy circles, tapping like a soft metronome. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked and stopped. I waited at the corner for a set of headlights I'd grown used to seeing turn in from the river, steady beams, a familiar engine, the kind of arrival you don't realize you've come to expect until it doesn't happen. They didn't appear. The street settled. The porch light stayed on, and the night pressed in just enough to make the air feel different. That Friday night never fully left me. I can still see that porch light burning soft against the fog, the kind of glow that feels like a promise someone forgot to keep. The next morning, the phone rang before sunrise. Dispatch said a truck driver had stopped at the bridge vehicle, left idling hazard lights on, no sign of anyone around. I remember the way my breath caught when she gave the plate number. It belonged to Mark Delaney. I drove out before the coffee even brewed the cruiser's headlights, slicing through a pale mist that clung to the river road like smoke refusing to lift. When I reached the bridge, the air was heavy and metallic, the kind that carries sound too far. A few sets of hazard lights pulsed against the guardrail, and the hum of the Delaney SUV cut through the quiet like a steady heartbeat that shouldn't have been there. The driver's door hung wide open, the dome light burning low and yellow. Mark's thermos sat in the cup holder, still half full steam curling from the spout. In the back seat was a backpack, blue with a frayed strap. I knew that bag. I'd seen Ethan carry it to Little League. There was no wallet on the dash, no phone on the seat, just that open door and the hum of an engine waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. I walked the span's slow flashlight cutting over wet concrete. The mist moved thick across the rails, and below it the river made that low, constant sound like breath drawn through teeth. The sheriff arrived 20 minutes later, jaw tight, coat collar up against the cold. He said it looked like a walk-off suicide, maybe, or a father who'd just reached the end of something none of us had seen coming. We pulled the truck off to one side, called for divers, marked the scene, but even as I wrote the report, my hand wouldn't steady. There was no scuff on the guardrail, no skid marks. It looked staged, too clean. By midday, we had boats combing the water deputies on both banks. The dogs were useless. The current confused them. They'd pick up a trail halfway across the bridge and lose it in the air, pacing in circles until handlers pulled them back. I remember the way one of the divers came up shaking his head. He said the river was colder than usual, that it dropped off fast, just past the middle pier, deep enough to swallow a car if you didn't know the bottom. By evening, the wind had picked up sharp and damp, and we still had nothing. No footprints on the embankment, no drag marks, no bodies. Just that open door and the echo of water against steel. When night came, we parked a cruiser at each end of the bridge and left one light flashing. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the empty lane where the Delaneys had last been. My notepad felt heavier than usual in my pocket, the kind of weight that stays with you when you're too young to know what won't leave. The sheriff closed the search just after midnight. "We'll sweep again tomorrow," he said, but his tone carried something final. He didn't want to say it, but I could tell we were already shifting from rescue to recovery. Days passed in a blur of forms and rumors. Folks in town said Mark had been different lately. Some whispered about money problems, others said grief had finally caught him after losing his wife. One theory turned into another, and by the end of the week, everyone had a version that made sense only to them. The sheriff went on record calling it a likely drowning. The press printed a single column, then moved on. But I couldn't. I drove by that bridge every night for weeks, after headlights cutting the same fog, waiting for the river to give something back. It never did. 23 years later, I stood on that same bridge again. Older, quieter, wearing a badge that didn't shine quite as bright. The asphalt had cracked from winters and salt, and the guardrails carried rust like freckles. The river still sounded the same, though low, steady, unconcerned. I'd come because the past had forced its way back. A construction crew had been dredging the bank for a new water line when they hit something hard beneath the silt. What they pulled up wasn't driftwood. It was a bone long and pale, wrapped in shreds of denim. Forensics confirmed it the next day, male, early 40s. Mark Delaney. I was back on the case not because anyone told me to be, but because I couldn't stay away. It was mine once before I knew how long a shadow an open case could cast. The file sat thick on my desk. Now the edges yellowed my old handwriting, staring back like a younger version of me asking what I'd missed. I turned page after page, Polaroids of the SUV, typed reports with carbon smudges, lists of interviews that had gone nowhere. The same questions I'd written in the margins back then still had no answers. But one thing was different now. Mark hadn't drowned. He'd been stabbed. The medical examiner laid out the bones on a steel table, her gloved finger tracing the small notch carved into one rib. "This wasn't an accident," she said. "Clean, deliberate." I felt my throat tighten, the kind of reaction you don't show in front of colleagues. All those years of picturing the river pulling him under, and now I had to unsee it to trade it for the image of a knife and a man fighting for breath on land. I asked about the boy, though I already knew what she'd say. "No sign of him," she replied. "Not yet." When I stepped outside the morgue, the air hit cold and sharp. The sun was low, turning the river bronze in the distance. I called Vega, who'd come up through the ranks after me. "You want company on this one?" he asked. I told him I did. We started by reopening the paper trail, the last calls Mark made, the errands he'd run, the list of people he'd trusted. His office still stood between the florist and the insurance agency, though the gold lettering on the window had long since peeled away. The new dentist let us in to look around. The floor plan was the same: 2 operatories, a small waiting room, a break table against the back wall. It smelled of disinfectant and something faintly metallic. I could almost see Mark, their jacket hung neat hand steady over a chart. The police record said he and Ethan were headed to a cabin that weekend, but no one ever confirmed which one. His sister thought it might have been near the river, but couldn't remember the name of the road. The SUV was found miles from any known property he owned. That's the kind of detail that doesn't sit right even decades later. I stared at the old photos, the way the keys hung from the ignition, the thermos still upright in the holder, and the backpack perfectly centered on the seat. None of it looked accidental. It looked arranged. That evening, I drove past the old Delaney house. Another family lived there now, kids' bikes on the porch wind chime clinking in the breeze. I parked across the street and watched a while, not out of morbid curiosity, but because some part of me needed to see that life had gone on there. I pictured Mark stepping out the door in his usual gray jacket, Ethan trailing behind, backpack slung over one shoulder, maybe teasing his dad about the radio station or how much farther they had to drive. Ordinary moments you can't know are your last until they are. My phone buzzed just as the porch light blinked on across the way. "Unknown number," I answered out of habit. A man's voice came through low gravel under the tone. "You're looking for the boy," he said. I froze, pulse catching in my throat. "Who is this?" I asked. But he didn't answer. Just a pause, and then, "You won't find him in the river." The line went dead. For a long time I sat there with the phone still to my ear, the echo of static lingering like a sound that didn't want to fade. My mind raced through possibilities. Crank call coincidence, maybe even one of the old suspects trying to spook me. But the phrasing lodged deep. It was nearly identical to a tip we'd received in '97, a call that had been dismissed because it came from a payphone and couldn't be traced. The words back then were slightly different. "Don't bother with the river." By morning, I'd made up my mind. I filed a request for the old phone logs and asked the carrier to trace the recent number. Vega met me at the precinct, thermos in hand, same as he always carried. "You look like you've been up all night," he said. I told him I had. I replayed the call for him word for word. He leaned back thoughtful. "Could be someone who's been sitting on something for a long time," he said. "Or could be someone who wants to mess with you." I nodded, though the voice still echoed too clearly in my head to feel random. We spent the rest of that morning buried in the archives, pulling the original call sheets from the week after the disappearance. Paper browned at the edges, ink faded to gray, but the handwriting was mine. Halfway down a page dated October 15th, 1997, the entry stared up at me like a fingerprint anonymous mail caller. Said not to bother with the river. 23 years between them, same tone, same warning. Someone had been watching this case all along. By late afternoon, we drove out to Ridgetop. The town hadn't changed much, the same flickering diner sign, the same library steps cracked from freeze-thaw winters. We stopped first at the library to speak with Karen Willis, one of Ethan's old classmates. She worked there now, soft-spoken, careful with her words. She said Ethan had been quiet, a boy who loved baseball cards and stuck close to his dad after his mom passed. "He once told me it was just the two of them now," she said, voice low, like they were in on a secret together. Then she hesitated. But the week before they disappeared, he started looking over his shoulder a lot. Asked if I ever felt like somebody was following me. That detail caught in my chest. Kids don't usually say things like that unless they've seen something they can't name. I thanked her, left my card, and we stepped back into the gray light of late afternoon. The wind had picked up off the river again, carrying that faint metallic tang I remembered from years ago. I watched a leaf spin across the parking lot and felt something cold settle behind my ribs. That night I drove home with the windows cracked, needing air. The highway lights blurred through the mist, and each one felt like the beat of a memory pressing closer. My phone sat on the passenger seat, dark and silent, but I kept glancing at it anyway, waiting for that voice to come back. Part of me wanted it to. The other part already knew the truth that whoever he was, he hadn't called to warn me off. He'd called to tell me I was already too close. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light glowed the same soft amber it always did. For a moment, it felt like nothing had changed, like the years between then and now could fold back on themselves. But the quiet had a new edge to it, the kind that makes you glance over your shoulder before stepping inside. The kind that tells you a story you thought had ended is only just beginning. The next morning, the air felt heavy, like the river had climbed up into the sky overnight and refused to leave. I barely slept. Every creak of the apartment made me think of that call, that voice telling me I was looking for the boy in the wrong place. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee gone cold, replaying every word, every pause. It wasn't just the content of what he said, it was the way he said it. Calm, certain, like a man who'd been carrying something for too long and had finally decided to share just enough to keep you chasing him. By 8 o'clock, Vega was already at the precinct, half a sandwich in one hand, thermos in the other. I could tell by his eyes he'd been reading through the files before dawn. He listened while I told him about the call again, exactly as it happened. When I finished, he just nodded once and said, "Then we find him." We started at the county records building, one of those stone structures where time and humidity make the walls smell like dust and ink. The clerks knew us by now and didn't ask questions when we signed in for archived material. Vega pulled the tip logs from 1997, long sheets of yellow paper stapled into a binder that looked ready to fall apart. I went line by line until I found it. Anonymous male caller said not to bother with the river. The handwriting was my own. Seeing it again made the years collapse like wet cardboard. The similarity to last night's message wasn't coincidence. I'd written that note 23 years ago, and the same voice had just repeated it. Whoever he was, he'd been watching this case all along. That thought kept circling me as we drove north toward Ridgetop. The town had that same too-quiet stillness I remembered. Same store signs, just sun-bleached now. The diner with the coffee cup still blinking neon. We parked by the library where we'd arranged to meet someone. Vega had tracked down a woman named Karen Willis. She'd been Ethan's classmate back in '97, a kid then, now a counselor at the elementary school. She met us in the children's section, hair tied back, a cautious smile that told me she'd been rehearsing what she might say. When I asked what she remembered of Ethan, her voice softened, almost maternal. "He was sweet," she said. "Quiet. Always had a deck of baseball cards in his pocket. Used to trade them during lunch." She paused and her eyes drifted to a point past me. "But that last week before they disappeared, he was different." I waited. "Different how?" She frowned, thinking. "Jumpy." He kept asking if I ever felt like someone was following me. I told him he watched too many movies, but he wasn't joking. I could tell. The way she said it, the certainty in her tone gave me a chill I couldn't shake. I thanked her, handed her my card, and promised to call if we learned anything. Outside, Vega lit a cigarette even though he'd quit years ago. "So maybe he wasn't imagining it," he said. "Maybe somebody really was following them." The words hung there while the wind kicked leaves across the sidewalk. I didn't answer, but I think we both knew he was right. We went from there to the sheriff's archives, a cinder-block building behind the courthouse where the old evidence boxes were kept. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of mildew. I ran my fingers across the labels, case numbers fading under tape until I found the one marked Delaney Mark Ethan. When I opened it, the smell of paper and age hit hard. Polaroids, reports, typed statements, all neatly stacked and forgotten. I spread them across a table under the flickering fluorescent light. Vega came around beside me, reading over my shoulder. The more we sifted, the clearer it became that the investigation back then had never gone beyond the surface. They'd assumed a drowning before the divers even finished the first sweep. The only real oddity was a handwritten note unsigned mailed a week after the disappearance. The postmark was from Dallas. The words read, "Check closer to home. The boy isn't lost. He's kept." I traced those letters with my thumb, trying to feel the mind behind them. "No follow-up?" I asked. Vega shook his head. "None recorded." He pointed at the corner of the page. Same phrasing again. "The boy isn't lost." That was enough to send us looking for people who might have had reason to hide something all those years ago. We started with Mark's old business partner, Dr. Harold Fenwick. His practice sat 2 towns over in a building that looked like it had been built from the same blueprint as Mark's. The waiting room smelled of fluoride and carpet cleaner. Fenwick was older now, thin hair-lined face, cautious eyes behind gold frames. When we introduced ourselves, his jaw set, but he motioned us into his office. "I figured this might come back one day," he said before we even asked a question. "You were close to Mark Delaney," I said. "We built the practice together. He was a good man, better dentist than me. Yet the file says you were being investigated for billing irregularities," Vega added. Fenwick gave a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That was a misunderstanding. I was cleared. But Mark was threatening to report you," I said. He looked past me, gaze fixed on the diplomas lining the wall. "He threatened a lot of things that year. Grief makes people unpredictable." His tone had a finality to it, like he'd said that line before rehearsed it even. I pressed once more, asked where he'd been the night the Delaneys vanished. He said he was home, his wife could vouch. Then he paused, remembering. "She's gone now. You'll have to take my word for it." When we left, Vega exhaled hard. "He's hiding something." I didn't disagree, but I wasn't sure what it was. Guilt doesn't always mean murder. Sometimes it's the residue of looking away. From there, we drove south 3 hours down the interstate to Houston, where Mark's younger brother Peter had last been listed. His neighborhood was quiet. Low houses, cracked sidewalks, stray cats sunning on mailboxes. Peter answered the door in a faded t-shirt, eyes bleary but sharp underneath. He didn't look surprised to see us. When I said we were reopening his brother's case, he nodded slowly. "Took you long enough," he said, voice flat. Inside, the air smelled of stale beer and old paper. Newspapers covered the table, the kind that collect when someone means to recycle but never does. He sat down opposite us, elbows on knees. "Everyone thought I killed him back then," he said. "Lost my job over it. Couldn't walk into a bar without hearing whispers." "Why do you think they suspected you?" I asked. He shrugged. "Because I wasn't the golden boy. Mark was the one everybody liked, the dentist, the husband, the perfect dad. Me, I was the screw-up. Easy math." He rubbed his jaw and glanced at the floor. "But he wasn't perfect, you know. He had secrets. I heard things." "What kind of things?" Vega asked. Peter hesitated, then leaned in, voice low. "Ask around about his patients. Some of those women weren't there for dental work, especially after Ellen got sick." I didn't answer. I just thanked him and left him standing in his doorway, staring at the ground. On the drive back, the highway unspooled in long silver lines under the headlights. Vega was the first to speak. "You think he's telling the truth?" "I think he's telling his truth," I said. "Whether it's the same as reality, that's another story." Still, his words lingered. If Mark had been seeing patients outside the office, that opened a whole new set of motives. Jealous husbands, angry lovers, anyone with something to lose. We decided to start there. The courthouse archives held the old billing records, rows of boxes, each one marked by year. We pulled 1997, flipped through card after card until a pattern appeared. Names of patients who'd been billed for multiple visits in short windows, some paid in cash, some with insurance that didn't match their listed address. One name showed up 6 times in 3 months, Melanie Carter. Next to one of her appointments, Mark had written 2 words in the margin, "after hours." We tracked her down through a nursing registry. She was 41 now, a nurse at a rehabilitation center. She met us outside during her lunch break, arms folded tight, eyes scanning the lot as she talked. "I was 19, she said. He was older, charming, said he wanted to help me with my smile. He called after my appointment, offered to take me to coffee." She stopped, swallowed hard. "It wasn't just coffee." "How long did it last?" I asked. "Couple of months. Then he stopped answering my calls. His wife was getting worse. I moved away." "Did anyone ever threaten him or you?" She frowned. "Once, yeah. Some guy in an old green truck sat outside my apartment. I thought it was nothing, but he watched me. When I went back inside, he drove off. A green truck." Vega looked at me over her shoulder but didn't speak. We thanked her and left. The pattern repeated with another woman, a divorcee named Caroline Hughes, who admitted to a brief affair during the same time. When I asked how it ended, she said, "He told me it had to stop. Said someone was following him." By the time we got back to the precinct that evening, the air felt different. Heavy again, charged like before a storm. Vega dumped the files on my desk, rubbing his eyes. 2 women, same time frame, both mentioned being watched. "That's not random." I nodded. I was about to say something when my phone buzzed. No caller ID. I picked it up, heart already pounding. "Stop digging," the voice said. Same gravel under the tone. "Or you'll end up where he did." Then the line went silent. I stared at the screen, waiting for it to light again. It didn't. Vega leaned forward. "What did he say?" I told him. His expression hardened. So he's still out there. I don't remember much of the next few minutes, just the sound of the fluorescent light humming overhead and the faint buzz in my ears. I'd spent my whole career chasing ghosts, but this was different. This one was watching back. When I finally drove home, rain had started to fall, thin and cold, the kind that soaks through your collar before you can turn your face away. I pulled into my lot, shut off the engine, and sat there a while. Across the street under the lamp, a dark sedan idled. Headlights off, just a faint outline in the mist. I told myself it was coincidence. Another tenant, maybe. But when I stepped out, the engine revved and the car eased away. Inside, I poured a glass of water and stood by the window. The reflection staring back looked older than I remembered, tired around the eyes. I told myself to breathe, to think. If this was the same man from the call 23 years ago, he wasn't just holding information, he was protecting something. The question was whether it was the truth or himself. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every sound in the apartment seemed amplified, the ticking clock, the pipes creaking the wind against the glass. Somewhere out there, a man had waited 23 years to speak, and I had the feeling he wasn't done yet. When I finally drifted off, it was to the faint hum of the river in the distance, the same low murmur I'd heard all those years ago when the Delaneys vanished. And even half asleep, I could still hear his words echoing steady and certain. "You won't find him in the river." The rain came back the next morning, thin and cold, the kind that doesn't soak you outright, but stays in the air like a second skin. The town looked smaller under it. Quiet streets, shop fronts streaked with water, the same bridge rising gray in the distance. I parked by the courthouse and sat there for a long time, engine idling, thinking about that last phone call. The voice had said, "Stop digging, or you'll end up where he did." I'd heard threats before in my career, angry suspects, grieving families, but this one didn't sound like a man bluffing. It sounded like someone warning me because he knew what had happened to Mark. Vega met me at the door with 2 coffees and a look that told me he'd barely slept either. We didn't talk much as we walked through the corridor. You can tell when a partner's mind is running the same route as yours. Words just slow it down. In the evidence room, the files were still spread where we'd left them, old reports, photos curling at the corners. The anonymous letter from 1997 that now felt like a fuse waiting all these years to burn. The postmark from Dallas still stood out smudged but legible. Check closer to home. The boy isn't lost, he's kept. I said the words out loud quietly. Vega looked up. Kept, he repeated. That's not just a warning, that's ownership. The word stayed with me. We'd spent weeks thinking about death marks, maybe Ethan's, but what if the boy hadn't died at all? What if he'd been taken hidden, kept? The idea felt impossible, and yet something about it fit too neatly with the rest. The phone calls, the eyes I'd felt on me since reopening the case, the strange sense that the story we'd been told 23 years ago was only half of what happened. We started by pulling the old property records for the land around the bridge and the river. The sheriff's department had cleared that area years ago, but back then the search had focused on the water, not the woods. Vega traced a finger along the map spread on the table. Here, he said, the quarry. It was still operational in '97, owned by a private company out of St. Louis. Caretaker on site. I looked at the name. Albert Garrison. The clerk in the recorder's office remembered him. Said he'd lived alone in a small shack on the quarry road, a quiet man, maybe too quiet. Died in 2001, buried in the town cemetery. Folks said he kept to himself, she told us. But I recall once he brought a little boy to church. Thought maybe a nephew. My stomach dropped. When was that, I asked. She frowned, thinking. Late 90s, maybe. Boy looked scared, wouldn't let go of his sleeve. By the time she finished, Vega was already on his phone pulling the death certificate. Garrison had no next of kin, no record of children, no criminal record either. Just a single employment history tied to the quarry and a government pension after he passed. We drove out that afternoon following the road past the bridge and into the trees until the gravel gave way to mud. The quarry sat hollowed and still, rain pooling in its base and fences, half collapsed. We found the shack about 100 yards in weathered boards, bowing door, crooked on one hinge. Inside, the air was stale with damp wood and rot. My flashlight cut across the floor old bottles, a rusted cot frame, a pile of broken tools. In the far corner, half buried under leaves, was a small shoe. Blue canvas rubber sole split down the middle, a faded baseball sticker still clinging to the side. I crouched and picked it up with gloved hands. Size 6 children's, the kind Ethan would have worn. Vega's voice was quiet behind me. He loved baseball, didn't he? I didn't answer. I couldn't. We bagged the shoe and called the lab. They said it would take weeks to get anything from it if they could at all. The decades hadn't been kind. Still, it felt like proof the story was shifting. Maybe Mark hadn't jumped or been dragged into the river. Maybe he'd been killed trying to protect his son. Back at the precinct that night, I spread out what we had on Garrison. There wasn't much, a few tax slips, a church donation, a payroll stub. But on the back of one faint and nearly illegible someone had written a name, Reverend Blake. He'd been the pastor of the Hilltop Church for 40 years, still was. We drove up there the next morning. The steeple was black against a low gray sky, bells quiet. Inside the pews smelled of dust and lemon polish. The Reverend was sorting hymnals when we entered. He remembered Garrison right away. Strange man, he said, adjusting his glasses. Came to service now and then. Never spoke much. Always sat in the back. Did he ever bring anyone with him, I asked. The Reverend nodded slowly. Once. A boy, maybe 8 or 9. Thin, frightened, wouldn't meet my eyes. Did he introduce him? No. I assumed family. But when I asked later, he said the boy was under his care. That was all. Did you ever see the boy again? Never. The way the Reverend said it made the space between us go quiet. He folded his hands on the pew rail and looked down at them. I wish I'd asked more questions, he said. On the drive back, Vega tapped the steering wheel. So Garrison had a boy living with him, he said. And if the timing's right... It's right, I said. The Delaneys disappeared that same fall. We spent the next few days combing what was left of the quarry property. Most of it had been reclaimed by trees, the edges softened by moss and dirt, but near the old caretaker's shack we found carvings on the inner wall. Names, marks, words, half-faded. One phrase repeated 3 times, scratched deep into the wood. "I want Mom." I ran my fingers across the grooves, feeling the splinters catch under my glove. For a moment I could almost see the small hand that made them. Later that evening we took what we had back to the station. The evidence board had started to fill photos, maps, old reports, the shoe, now the carvings. "He kept him here," Vega said quietly. "All that time." I nodded. "But if Garrison died in 2001, what happened after?" Someone else must have known. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed again. A text this time, not a call. No number, just, "You ask the wrong shepherds. The lamb is still among us." Attached was a photo of the church we'd visited that morning. The angle was from across the street, exactly where we'd parked. My stomach turned. Vega saw the screen and exhaled. "He's watching us, Claire. Every move." That night, against every rule I'd ever taught younger detectives, I went back to the quarry alone. The moon was out, weak and pale, barely breaking the clouds. The air smelled of wet earth and rust. I parked at the gate and walked the rest on foot, flashlight low. The shack looked smaller in the dark. Inside, everything was as we'd left it, except one thing. In the dirt near the cot lay a baseball card, edges frayed, the picture worn to a blur. I picked it up, heart pounding. On the back, written in pencil, were 2 words: "Still here." I stood there longer than I care to admit, the card trembling in my hand. Every instinct told me I wasn't alone. The wind shifted outside, and for a second I thought I heard movement in the brush, too soft to be an animal, too quick to be the wind. I stepped out, light sweeping the trees, but there was nothing. Only rain starting again, gentle at first, then harder. When I turned back toward the shack, a single boot print was stamped fresh in the mud by the doorway, larger than mine heel worn down. I followed it halfway into the trees before it vanished in the undergrowth. By the time I got back to my car, I was soaked through. I sat behind the wheel and stared at that card under the dashlight. It wasn't possible for Ethan to have left it, not after so long. But the handwriting looked young, unsteady, uneven, like a boy's. I locked the evidence in my glove compartment and drove home with the feeling that the story was closing in, not opening up. The next morning, Vega showed up at my door before I'd even poured coffee. He looked at me, then the card, and said what I'd been thinking. If that boy survived, he might still be out there. Or someone wants us to believe he is, I said. We didn't talk much after that. The day moved in slow motion, reports, filed phone calls, placed silence where answers should have been. Near dusk, the lab called. The DNA from the shoe was too degraded for a match, but they found traces consistent with human skin cells, 2 contributors, 1 adult, 1 juvenile. I thanked them, hung up, and stared at the wall. It wasn't proof of life, not yet, but it was enough to keep going. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills, I drove out to the river again. The bridge loomed the same way it always had, steel bones rising from the mist. I parked, stepped out, and leaned against the guardrail. The water below was dark, restless. For the first time in weeks, I let myself think of Mark not as a victim, but as a father, a man who might have known what was coming and faced it anyway to give his son a chance. Somewhere out there, a child had grown into a man, whether by survival or by silence. And if he was still walking this earth, he'd spent 2 decades in the shadow of someone else's sin. The wind off the water lifted the edge of my coat, carrying the faint smell of rain and rusted metal. I looked out over the current and said it out loud, though no one was there to hear. You're not lost. You were kept. The river didn't answer, but in the distance, past the line of trees, a single light flickered near the quarry road. brief, deliberate like a signal. I watched it fade and waited for the dark to settle again. I knew right then the story wasn't finished. Someone out there still wanted to be found. The light near the quarry burned only once more that night, then disappeared. I stood at the edge of the bridge until the air turned colder and my breath began to show. I wanted to believe it was a trick of reflection that the storm had thrown the light wrong, but the truth is, I knew someone had been there. Whoever they were, they'd waited for me to see it. That was the last time I stood on that bridge without backup. By morning, the entire area was sealed off again for a coordinated search, the kind we should have done 23 years earlier. The FBI joined the state task force within days. Once the old quarry maps were pulled, we learned Garrison hadn't owned the land outright. He'd leased sections of it from a private holding company. They found 3 sealed shafts that hadn't been cataloged since the late 90s. Inside the second one, deep under layers of debris and concrete, we found what was left of a life Mark Delaney had never meant to leave behind. A rusted lantern, a torn piece of flannel that matched the jacket he'd been wearing that night, and 2 sets of small handprints in dried mud along the inner wall, one adult, one child. Further down, past the ledge where the shaft narrowed, the team found remains. Skeletal, compact, arranged almost carefully. The DNA came back as male, mid to late 40s Mark. He'd been struck at the base of the skull, just like the coroner suspected years ago. But the second discovery didn't come until a week later, when another team searching a connected mine opening found a series of carvings along the tunnel wall, dates, tally marks, and 3 words etched over and over. Still waiting, still waiting, still waiting. At the end of that same tunnel, sitting upright against a collapsed timber, they found what looked like a sleeping form in rotted fabric. The remains were smaller bones, not yet fully grown at the time of death. The jacket had the initials ED stitched into the lining. Ethan had been there all along, not lost, not taken away somewhere distant, just trapped under the ground within miles of home. Forensics would later show he'd survived for some time after his father died. Weeks, maybe even months, living in a closed-off section of the mine that Garrison must have used as a hiding place. He'd left marks trying to scratch his way out, then just stopped. When I got the call confirming the DNA match, I sat at my desk and couldn't make myself write the report. I'd been chasing his shadow so long that the finality of it didn't feel real. It was Vega who said the words I couldn't. We found them both. That's all. No celebration, no victory. Just a kind of quiet that fills the air when there's nothing left to chase. The investigation turned toward finding who had sealed the mine. Old purchase orders showed a local contractor had been paid cash to weld one of the entries shut in late '97. The payment came from a post office box rented under an alias. The handwriting on the form matched Garrison's, but there were 2 signatures, one his, one we couldn't place. That mystery ended 3 months later when a librarian in Montana, of all people, recognized a face from an old wanted circular we'd posted online. She called it in. "He comes in here once a month," she said. "Quiet man, maybe late 70s. Reads military history. When agents brought in the photo she'd marked, my stomach turned. It was him, the voice on the phone, the watcher in the dark. Randall Clark. He'd been a drifter back in the 90s, doing odd maintenance jobs around the county, including at the quarry. He'd met Garrison during that period. When they finally caught up to him living out of a camper near Helena, he didn't resist. He just asked for coffee. During questioning, he confessed in fragments, never in full sentences, never directly, but enough to piece it together. He'd followed the Delaneys that night, saw them stop on the bridge. Said he'd needed supplies. He claimed Garrison had helped him move the bodies. Then, almost as if he were proud, he said, "The boy lived a while. He didn't suffer." He gave no motive that made sense. No reason that could hold weight against what he'd done. He only said, "Some people are chosen to keep the quiet things quiet." When pressed on what that meant, he shut down. Eventually in court, the charges stretched across 5 murders in total, Mark Ethan, and 3 others tied to unsolved disappearances in nearby states. He was sentenced to life without parole. During sentencing, he looked at me once across the room and smiled like he recognized me from somewhere. I still don't know what that smile meant. After the trial, Vega retired. He said his bones couldn't take another winter of long drives and late nights. He moved downstate, started a small farm with his wife. Every Christmas, he still sends a card with a single line inside "Keep your notebook." I keep them all in the top drawer of my desk. The Delaney property was sold years ago, but the new owners allowed the county to place a memorial stone in their yard, just by the old maple tree. The engraving reads simply, "Mark and Ethan Delaney forever together, by the river." No dates, no sermon, just the truth in plain words. The community came out for the dedication, even people who hadn't lived here in decades. I stood in the back, raincoat zipped, watching the fog roll over the water. The same river that had hidden them had finally given them back, though not in the way anyone hoped. I think about that bridge often. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I drive out there and park with the headlights off. The guardrails are new now, the asphalt smooth. But the sound of the river hasn't changed. It's the same steady current that's carried everything we've ever lost. And every time I hear it, I think of Ethan's last carvings, those 3 words repeated again and again in the dark. I try not to picture his hands pressing into the cold rock, but I always do. For years I wondered what kind of man could stand over that and walk away. Now I know it's not always a monster with horns or a stranger in a mask. Sometimes it's the man you pass on the sidewalk, the one who nods politely and goes about his day. Evil doesn't always look like a storm. Sometimes it looks like still water. When people ask if I feel relief now that the case is closed, I tell them yes, but not the kind that brings peace. It's the kind that lets you breathe just enough to keep going. Closure isn't a door that shuts. It's a window that stops rattling for a while. The river's edge has changed since then. There's a fence now and a small sign that reads "No trespassing." Quarry property closed. The shack is gone. The mine shafts are filled and sealed. But when the wind moves through the trees, I swear I can still hear the faint echo of that lantern clinking against metal. The scrape of something small trying to be found. I've learned not to call it haunting. It's memory doing what memory does, refusing to leave quietly. Every year on the anniversary, a few locals bring flowers to the memorial. Most just drive by, slow windows down like they're paying respect without stopping. I go out early before anyone else arrives. I stand by that stone and run my fingers across the names. It's always colder there, even in spring. Maybe that's coincidence. Maybe it's just the river reminding me that time doesn't erase, it only covers things over until someone looks close enough to see through the surface. The file sits closed now. The photos, the evidence, the notes boxed, labeled, and shelved. But sometimes when I pass the storage room, I think I can smell river water again. Not strong, just enough to take me back to that night in '97, the mist curling low hazard lights blinking into fog, a thermos still steaming. I think about how something so ordinary, a bridge, a quiet town, a father and son heading for a weekend away, can fold into tragedy without anyone hearing the sound. That's what stays with me after all this time, how quiet it was. How silence can hold a story long after everyone stops asking for it. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because sometimes remembering is the only justice we have left.